Okay, so welcome everybody and thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're going to be talking about interview skills for postgraduate people today. Interviews are a really interesting one because we often underestimate the importance of what you need to be actually talking about in an interview. We often think that we want to go in and talk to the interviewer in context of all those things that we think are important. But sometimes forget about the selection criteria and forget about what the employer is actually looking for. So the other thing I'll also say is that people often get quite overwhelmed when they're preparing for interviews or when they're going to an interview. Interviews is really like anything else; it's practice. And so if you're thinking about, if you're preparing for an interview, it's just important that you take some time to practice with somebody that you trust, whether it's somebody that's close to you, whether it's somebody here in the careers service. It's an important step, and there is a way to approach an interview, which is very much about, which we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about, firstly, preparing for interviews, the types of interviews that you can expect, because there are a number of different types, typical type of questions and where those questions come from, because again, people get quite nervous because they're thinking, well, what might they ask me? But what's very important is that when you consider what people are going to ask you, there's some common places that you can look and you can essentially go that way. Then we're going to do a little group activity. So I know there's about 10 of us here. So we're going to look at some selection criteria, and I'm going to get you to try and write a couple of interview questions based on that selection criteria. And then if we've got time, we might do a couple of little mock interview questions. But again, the thing with a mock interview is that you do have to still do some preparation. That's important. So we can't just expect people to be able to answer a question without having some sort of preparation. But we'll talk about that when we get to that point. And then finally, we're just going to talk about some stereotypes that go with people that have got high degrees, PhDs, and what have you. And sometimes how some employers will stereotype people based on qualifications and what have you. All right, we did talk last week from the perspective of what an employer, or why it's important for an employer to get their selection right. Because from the employer's perspective, they are going to invest time and money into their candidate or into their employee, and so it's important that they do that they essentially look at all the people that are out there that could potentially do the job, and they know is going to be of value to them. So as we've talked about before, for those that were here last week, we definitely understand that an employer is not going to break even until you've been working for them for a particular period of time, and that's just part of the course. Okay, so what's the purpose of the interview? Well, clearly the purpose for the employer is that they want to hire the best candidate. But we often get into this, I guess, idea that when we're going for an interview, it's them interviewing you, and it's not necessarily about you interviewing them. I'm going to tell you that it's absolutely about you making sure that you're comfortable with the organisation that you're applying for. Because from your perspective, it's not just about you trying to demonstrate to them that you're suitable for the position, that you're motivated, although that's what you do need to do. But from that perspective, you want to make sure that the organisation you're going to is one that's going to be good for you. And so I want you to think about this as a two-way interview. It's not a one-way interview. And of course, you have to demonstrate that you're capable. You have to demonstrate that you're fitting with the organisation. But you must also consider this from the perspective of whether that employer is going to be suitable for your career as well. Okay, so what are employers looking for? Well, again, if we think about what an employer wants, they want to know, can you do the job, which is essentially your application and your resume. Will you do the job is what's your motivation? So why do you want to work for us? What do you know about us? But the interview is really about, will you fit in? And so if somebody gives you an interview, the reason that they're interviewing you is because they think you can do the job. And so what they're now looking for is essentially, what is the motivation? Why do you want to work for us? How enthusiastic are you in context of our position or our organisation? Good communication skills is crucial. And so again, in an interview, we're trying to identify whether you have good communication skills. I use the story of a speech pathologist I was interviewing. We had 5 people that we had to interview, and this particular speech pathologist on paper was the best candidate. But unfortunately, when it came to the interview, the student wasn't able to maintain eye contact with the interviewers. Head was down, didn't smile, very poor communication skills. And so from that perspective, the number 1 candidate that we had went from 1 to 5 and missed out on the position. So communication skills are important, but it's not just communication skills from the perspective of what you say. It's also communication skills in context of how you listen. And so in an interview, people will tell you things. They might say, look, this is what the position is about. And so when you get to the end of the interview, you might have some questions for them. You don't want to be asking questions about things that they've already covered. So again, this comes back to the whole idea of communication skills. Other things that they are looking for is how your experiences and behaviours match requirements. This is crucial, that when you're in an interview that you're using STAR examples, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But STAR examples are essentially talking about situations that you've been in and the tasks that you were doing, the actions that you took, and what the actual end result was of those actions that you took. But the key component there is that when you're being interviewed, that you're able to talk about other experiences that you've had and really emphasize the actions that you took. But again, we'll have a little bit of practice with that a little bit later. Already mentioned the idea of cultural fit with the organisation, but it's also important that you understand the organisation. One of the biggest complaints that we hear from employers in this office is that they interview a candidate was pretty good, but they don't know what we do. They didn't address our values. They didn't address what we essentially do as an organisation. And so you must make sure that when you go into an interview, you have some purpose, you have some focus, and that an employer wants to essentially see that you're quite aware of who you are and where you want to go. Presentation, timing, dress, body language, all these things are very important in an interview, and we'll expand on that in a moment. Confidence dealing with nerves. Sometimes people can walk into an interview and be quite nervous. Now, an interviewer will generally expect that, so they can be quite flexible and reasonable around that. But it's important that you know how to deal with your nerves if you are somebody that does get a little bit nervous prior to an interview. And then the other thing is that any position that you work in or operate in these days is very much a situation that people will. It's a learning process. So lots of things that you've learned at university and lots of things that you've learned in other positions will be very valuable to where you're going, but the learning doesn't stop. So there's got to be a desire to learn, and you've got to demonstrate that in an interview as well. Okay, so our interview preparation includes understanding the interview process. So there's going to be different types of interviews that you're going to potentially have to participate in, and sometimes it's not one interview, it might be 2 or 3 interviews. So you need to understand what the process is going to be so that you can get through that interview comfortably. You need to be able to know, it mentioned before about self-awareness, you need to know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and particularly those strengths in context of what the employer is looking for. And when we talk about weaknesses, it's not about telling the employer everything that you can't do, but it's very much about telling the employer about areas where you've had a weakness and you've essentially turned it into a strength. So that's the way that we would treat those weakness questions. Again, we'll have a look at that in a moment. I've emphasised this before, you must research the employer. What the employer does and how you fit in with the values and the skills that they're looking for, how you align with all of that is really the key to being successful in an interview. So it's not about going in and randomly talking about things which are not what the employer is looking for. It's important that you have a really good understanding of what the selection criteria is and that you can address that selection criteria in context of the employer. So it's important that you review the duty statement, you look at the advertisement, you look at the key points and the criteria that they're looking for, and that you also review your application and resume, because that's what got you the interview in the first place. So if you've put forward a resume and an application, and you've been successful in getting an interview, well, then it stands to reason that you've got that you've done something right. So the employer is not looking for other information; they're looking for what you've essentially put in that application. Look, when I say they're not looking for other information, you can still talk about other information, but essentially, if you stuck to what you have submitted in your application, that should at least be hold you in good stead. But the other thing to think about before we talk about the type of interviews is that one thing that I often think about is that people will be very hard on themselves when they're unsuccessful in an interview. But if you consider that an interviewer will essentially may interview 10 people, and of those 10 people, you might find that 8 of them are suitable. So you as the interviewer, how are you going to select the one person? And that one person that you do select, it might come down to some very small detail, some very small things which have occurred, which will be important to you as an employer. It might just be that you've built some rapport in that interview. We like each other, and so we're going to essentially select somebody based on the fact that they have a similar interest to myself if I'm the interviewer. So little things get you across the line. So I just want to be clear on that, because sometimes people get very, very hard on themselves because they missed out. But you're often going into an interview with other very suitable candidates as well. And the reality is, as I said, there's probably a number of people that could be employed in that position, which and the employer has to make a decision. So your point of difference, is what you really need to highlight in an interview. Okay, the type of interviews that do exist. Firstly, we have traditional one-on-one interviews. So those traditional one-on-one interviews are just simply maybe over a desk, over a cup of coffee, that type of thing. It's one person interviewing another. The more common one that we do get in academia is panel. So you might apply for an academic role, and you will generally have 3 or 4 people on the other side that are interviewing you. And again, it's important that when you have a panel that you address everybody in the panel. Don't focus on one person. Often somebody will ask a question and you might get caught looking at that person rather than addressing the whole group. So it's important that you do that. Other interview types are group interviews. So that's when you go in and there's a group of people, and basically they're asking people in the group questions, and it works that way. An assessment centre, again, it involves groups, but it could be that they might get used to do some activities, and those activities will determine who is the leader in the room and who is the follower and who's the worker and all those sorts of things. So they use assessment centres for look at psychological testing and things like that. If you're really unlucky, you might get a telephone interview. Not my preferred one, because they don't get to see you. And as we're going to talk about in a moment, first impressions are very, very important. We've got Skype here, but Skype is probably now Zoom. But we know that people interview over the internet now, particularly since COVID hit last year. The whole online interview process has become more and more popular. You might be asked to present, and you might have some online computer-based interviews, which is essentially where you go into an interview and there's nobody on the other side. It's just a computer asking you questions, and it records you, and then somebody looks at it after that. So there's a whole range of different types of interviews that you might be asked to participate in. As we've said before, it's important that you understand what each of them is, or at least in terms of the ones that you might be asked to do. If you're not sure, then ask the organisation that you're being interviewed by to give you more information. Okay, but as we said before, the most common type of interview is the panel. So particularly if we're looking at senior academic posts, you'll have a panel of people, and they will generally ask questions around your research profile, your publications, if you've had any funding success, any research ideas you might have, any collaborations, and what have you. So it will be very much about you and your research. but there will be other aspects to it as well, which we'll discuss in a moment. But an industry position panel will usually consist of 2 to 3 staff members. It might be a mix of management and HR. And in that case, questions are based on selection criteria and the role functions. So they are a little bit different, but in any event, it's still important that we are prepared for either one. Are there any questions on any of that so far? Okay, so I mentioned the idea of good impressions. So interviews, when you walk into an interview, it's not uncommon for somebody to make up their mind in the first 30 seconds to a minute whether it's a yes or a no. Now, when I say a yes, somebody can make a decision very quickly that no, this is not somebody that suits us, and it might basically be because what you're wearing is not appropriate in terms of what the organisation's looking in terms of what they how they perceive themselves. And a specific example I can give you is one where a young lady was offered an interview, and she had to fly to Perth from Sydney, and so she jumped on the plane from Perth to Sydney. From Sydney to Perth. And she got to Perth. She went and essentially to the interview, and she was wearing a singlet top and UGG boots. UGG boots being winter kind of shoes, but something that's not appropriate for an interview. The interview didn't last long, and so she's gone all that way, and she's turned up wearing the wrong clothes. Now, does it mean that you have to wear a suit to every interview? No, it doesn't. What you need to know is what the culture of the organisation is and what their dress sense is. So if you turn up to for example, if you're essentially working for an engineering firm, well, most engineers don't wear suits, but they wear suitable clothing that you might wear in an engineering space. So you might wear something along those lines. But the important thing is that you consider your hair, facial hair as well. If you are wearing makeup, then you consider the makeup that you might put on, and all that sorts of things. Clothing is important. Make sure your shoes are clean. Make sure your nails are clean. I mean, it seems all things that are common sense, but it's very surprising how often somebody turns up to an interview and they look a little bit underdone. So it's important that we address that. But essentially, when we greet interviewers, that's going to be important. Our body language is important. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Okay, so I want you to think about first impressions. And so Albert Mehrabian, I think is how it's said. He's a professor of psychology, and he has done a number of research and publications on verbal and non-verbal messages. But he essentially talks about the importance of spoken words being only 7% of the, thing that the first impressions and attractions that come. So our voice and tone is very important because it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And also our body language. So if you've got somebody in an interview and they're sitting, slouched down and they don't look interested, it might be that they are interested, but the body language suggests that they're not. So that can be a particularly risky approach if you're going to take that approach. So it's important that when you're in an interview, you're sitting in a very not stiff position, but a very confident one, and that your arms and legs are essentially comfortable and you're sitting upright. You don't want to be slouching forward and what have you. And then the other thing to think about is if you're doing an online interview, again, how you position your camera and all those sorts of things becomes important, because the body language, the voice tone, all those sorts of things need to come through as well. Again, we'll expand on that in a moment. Now, it's very difficult when you're doing a phone interview because the only thing that comes across is the spoken word and the tone of your voice and what have you. But we would generally consider that the whole, if you can avoid a phone interview, fantastic. But again, you don't really get a choice because it's often the interviewer that makes that decision. So as we said, spoken words, the tone of voice, the body language are all important components. The audio quality is very important. So if you're going to be doing an online interview, think about the background noise, because sometimes there's noise in the background which to you might not seem that significant. You live with it every day, but it might be very off-putting to somebody that's interviewing you. The one thing that I strongly recommend that you always wear a headset, because the headset will generally cut out any background noise. And again, it's also, if you think about it from the perspective of the visual quality that you're dealing with, you've got to also be very aware of your background. So often people will have a very distracting background. So you can see me at the moment, in my background is just a brick wall, but ideally you just have something that has very little distractions behind you. What you don't want is a background that's essentially sitting in a let's say that you're sitting where there's a window, and you don't want your background. I did a Zoom session yesterday, and the guy was sitting at a window, and behind him there were all these trucks going driving in and out of wherever he was, and it was really distracting. So I would suggest that you make sure that you find a good quiet place that where you're not going to get disturbed, that you can actually conduct that interview. Other things that we said, your posture is important. We mentioned that. Your facial expressions are important. Now, it's very difficult when you're doing an online interview, because the camera is usually above your screen. And so if you're looking at the screen, you're actually not looking at the camera. So your eyes are off the camera. But again, you can practice trying to look at the camera as opposed to looking at the screen. But that's just one area where you have to, it takes practice. So again, facial expressions, eye contact, very important. This is your virtual handshake, which is very interesting at a time when people are essentially being discouraged to shake hands. So your posture, your facial expressions, your eye contact, your grooming becomes your virtual handshake, whether it's in an online interview or whether it's in a face-to-face interview. Now, when you're preparing for your interview, it's important that you check your technology. So don't just go in cold and go, well, I'm in an interview. Yeah, sorry, my interview's connection's not working very well. You've got to find somewhere that's reliable and suitable that you can use. So often people will actually come here to the university and find a space here that they can do some interviews, because the internet's generally pretty good if you don't have good internet at home. But as I said before, headphones with microphones. Look at your visual background, so make sure that there's minimal disturbances. Camera should be above eye level. So if you see my camera at the moment, it's low just because I'm sitting at a desk. But if I'm doing an interview, I'd lift it and I'd have it so that I'm actually at a good space that I'm just sort of trying to get the distractions out. So you can see now my posture's not great because I'm holding my computer up, but my posture needs to be upright and needs to be confident. Okay, I'm not sure what that sticky note at your camera actually means, but I'm not going to comment on that one, sorry. Okay, your virtual preparation, again, adjust lighting, so make sure that you're in a warm and natural light that's in front of you, not behind you. Minimize the background lighting and minimize the overhead lighting as well. There are some tips where you can have a look at. So these slides will be made available after this session, I'm sure. So Hugh will make them available to you. But you can actually go to these two different links and just have a little bit of a look at some of the tips that they have for you as well. Okay, so any questions on that side of it yet? Nothing so far? Okay, so in the interview, it's all about making sure that you listen and that you're clear. So when someone asks you a question, listen to the question. You don't need to answer it immediately. Pause for a moment. So one of the strategies that I like to use is I'm looking at the interviewer and I'm looking at the interviewer in not a what's the word I'm looking for? Not a creepy sort of way. I'm looking at the interviewer in a professional manner, and the interviewer will ask a question. And then to give myself a moment, I might look away and I'll think about the question that they've just asked me, and then I'll come back and I'll answer the question. So that's important that you buy yourself a little bit of time in an interview. That will help you with your nerves. One of the things that I often see with people when they're being interviewed is that they get asked a question and they immediately start to answer the question. And then they find halfway through it that they're rambling and they've not gone where they wanted to go. So again, it's important that you take a moment to think about how you're going to answer it. And then once you've had a few moments to think about that, you can then come back and answer it in a structured manner. So in that context, you need to be proactive. If you're not sure what the question was and you need to ask them to repeat it, well then seek clarification and ask them to repeat the question. Take time to answer that question. Don't rush in, as I just said, and look for opportunities to provide information which is based on the selection criteria or what it is that they're wanting, that they're looking for in an employee. So again, interviews, one of the things that the employer is looking for is some element of confidence. And what we mean by confidence, it's not somebody that is being overly I don't want to use the word. Somebody that's being confident without being overly confident, I guess. So you talk about things, self-talk, as we say, but with some element of confidence. You need to be clear and concise. You need to be. You don't want to be rambling or wandering. So this goes back to that idea of the weakness question. A lot of people get really uncomfortable when someone says, "Well, what's your biggest weakness?" So I'm going to ask that question now. If somebody would like to answer this, what is your biggest weakness? If you were in an interview and somebody asked you that question, how would you answer that? What is your biggest weakness? Okay, so Jackie's just saying that she's in an open space at the moment, so she can't answer that question openly. That's fine. Somebody else want to have a go at what your biggest weakness might be?
I say that sometimes I can be like really self-critical, like so I can sort of, yeah.
Okay, so when you say you're self-critical,
overly critical of myself, I guess.
Yeah. And a lot of people are. A lot of people, when they're doing interview practice, they'll record themselves in a tool we call interview stream, and they can be overly critical. They'll look at the question and they look at themselves on the camera, and they don't like how they look. They don't like what they're saying. So you need to be sensible in terms of how you do criticize yourself. So I absolutely agree with that. But how can you change it? How can you turn that into a strength?
I guess it could be a strength because I'm overly critical because I have high standards for myself and want to do a good job.
Good. So if we're going to talk about a weakness, we don't just say, well, I have this weakness. It's about really trying to direct it towards something that becomes a positive for the employer. I see Pat's got a microphone turned on. Pat, would you like to comment?
Oh, hi. Yes, I was just thinking because this is so, talking about my weakness in an interview is always something that I'm dread because it's I don't really know what to say. For example, one of the things that come to my mind is that sometimes I can be stubborn, but I know that that you can always turn that on the positive side, saying that I persist on task until I get them right, but I don't want to come across as somebody who wastes time or don't ask questions or has a really negative attitude. So it's, for me, it's always very hard to find because I know I have a lot of weaknesses, but how to find the right ones and how to turn them on positive things that may be right for that position. That's always been a question that I had in my mind.
Yeah. And look, you make a great point. So you say, well, somebody can be stubborn or somebody can have pay a lot of attention to detail, as Jackie just commented in the chat room. But they are things that can essentially be turned into strengths because, like you say, it's about stubbornness is really to some extent resilience. Attention to detail is really about being very particular and making sure that everything is getting done correctly. But we do know that in the workplace, it might sometimes there's time challenges. So when we do pay particular attention to detail, we need to do that to an extent, but we have to make sure that we're working within the organisation's capability. And so that's the important thing there, is to talk about your weakness in context of how it is a strength for that organisation that you're potentially looking to work for. Okay, well, very good. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so if we think about some interview content from an academic perspective, so if you're going to an interview and it's a junior postdoctoral type interview, it will be structured towards your research capabilities. They're going to ask you questions around that. They're going to ask you questions around your technical expertise and your dedication to the project. So you do need to talk about your PhD research and your current research work. The interviewer will also want to know how much of it is involved in, how much of it involved your input and original thinking. So they want to know that it's your work. They want to know what challenges you faced, how you've overcome those challenges, and what have you. So they're going to ask questions around that type of thing. Now I'm going to show you in a moment some questions, and we're going to have some practice at that. But if we're looking at it from an industry perspective, they're non-research positions. They're not so interested in your research, potentially. And so what you really need to focus your attention on is those key skills and abilities that you've potentially developed prior to doing your PhD, and even once you're doing a PhD or a master's or whatever it might be. They're very interested in your technical and generic skills, of course, because you have to have those technical skills. So, you can't be an engineer if you don't have technical skills around engineering, but you've also got to have all those transferable skills, which are things such as communication skills that we spoke about before, teamwork skills, and what have you. So it's really up to you to be able to articulate the relevance of your skills to the position and how you align with what they're looking for. And that's what we're going to discuss shortly. So, but you need to discuss your skills, results, and achievements. You need to make the employer aware that they are looking at someone who can make a real difference. And going back to what we spoke about before, it's being able to demonstrate your point of difference, but also your point of difference is not just your technical ability. Your point of difference needs to be, are you going to be somebody that's enjoyable to work with? Are there people in the team that are going to enjoy being a part of your team and what have you? So it's a combination of all those things. Okay, so where do we get the questions for the interview? So we mentioned the selection criteria. That's usually the first port of call. So we know that if they're asking if the selection criteria includes they want somebody who's a team player, then there's a good chance they're going to ask you a question about being in a team. We can also look at the position description because sometimes there isn't selection criteria. So you might just have to go on a position description or a job advertisement. But the other thing that you can look at is organisational priorities. What are the values of the organisation? What are the projects that they're doing? And so from that perspective, that will give you some ideas about where some of the questions might come from. Sorry, I'm just trying to move on to the next slide. Sorry, it's just stalling at the moment, so I'm sorry. I'm just trying to, here we go, good. Okay, so the type of questions that you can expect. Usually in any interview, they're going to want to know something about you. And so we have what we call an open-ended question. An open-ended question would start off something a little bit like, tell us a little bit about yourself. So I'm just going to ask you now for very briefly to, if somebody would like to tell me about themselves, but I want you to think of it in context of you're applying for a position here at the University of Newcastle in whatever discipline you're currently working, that you're studying in, but you're applying for a position, let's say it's a lecturer position. How would you answer the question, tell us a little bit about yourself? Any thoughts? And just while you're thinking about that, I want you to think about the idea that this question can be asked in many ways. It can be, tell me about yourself. Why are you the right person for the job? Why did you apply for this position? So it's essentially the same question. But tell me a bit about yourself. What do you think the employer wants to know? Nobody wants to have a crack? Okay, so I want you to think about this in context of if somebody says to me, tell me about, yes, and that's a good question, where do you start? So the first place I would start is I would tell them a little bit about myself. Absolutely, I'd say, well, what am I currently doing? So I'm currently studying a PhD or a master's or whatever it might be in a particular discipline. I've been studying in this area. Let's say you might give me a little bit of background. Prior to studying in this discipline, I was doing X, Y, and Z. The reason that I chose to go down this career path was whatever it is. But the next thing, that once you've given us that background information, the next piece of information that they want to know is, what do you know about the organisation? The reason I've applied for this position here is because I know that the University of Newcastle has values of X, Y, and Z. These values align really well with who I am as a professional. And then you can start talking about some of the generic selection criteria components that they're looking for. So, one thing that I can tell you about myself is that I'm a very good communicator. This can be demonstrated when I've been presenting to a class. In fact, a particular example was when I was talking to a group of academic staff and talking to them about my studies. And the way that I did that was that I spoke to them in a professional manner. I maintained eye contact, and I talked about my research, which was based on, again, and you talked a little bit about your research. So you see what we're doing is we're bringing in a combination of one, who you are and what you've been doing, but also skills that you've developed and how they are applicable to the employer. Because that's really what we're looking for. It's not just what have you studied and tell me all about your studies. It's also tell me about the skills that you developed while you were studying and how they align with the skills that we're looking for. Okay, and that question takes practice. So someone said, well, where do I start? It's not a question that you can just walk into an interview and answer without actually having some thought in terms of how you might answer that if you did have an interview. But I would expect everybody to expect that type of question. Tell me about yourself. Why did you apply for the position? Why you were the right person for this job? Why are you the outstanding candidate? All those questions are essentially, tell me about yourself and tell me what you know about us. Okay. The second type of question that you might get is one which is what we call a closed question. A closed question essentially asks you a question where you give a yes or no answer. So, do you like dealing with people? Yes, I do. No, I don't. Now, you're not going to just say yes or no. You're going to have to follow that up with some detail. So, do you like dealing with people? I don't expect anybody's going to say no to that. It'd be a very interesting interview if you did, but anyhow. So, do you like dealing with people? Yes, I enjoy dealing with people. Throughout my professional life, I've dealt with a number of people in all different walks of life. A specific example was when I was working at the university. I worked in a very diverse environment with a number of stakeholders, which were from all different levels. So starting with academic staff, students, professional staff, etc., etc. The way that I dealt with people was, and then that's where you give that STAR example again, which we'll talk about STAR in a little bit more detail in a moment. So now we've got an open question and a closed question. The most common type questions that you get are what we call scenario or behavioral questions. So in a scenario question, they're asking you a question which is about a particular situation that you might find yourself in if you're working with that organization. So again, you need to do your research because you need to think about what are some of the things that might happen in that organization that you would need to be able to deal with. So the example we've got here is you're working on a project in a team. One of the team members is not pulling their weight. How would you handle this situation? So without actually answering the question, what would be the best way to answer that question, do you think? would you just answer, I might do this, I might do that, or would you give me an example?
Yeah, you use the STAR technique, so you give like a specific example of something you've done.
Absolutely. So any scenario-based question or behavioral-based question, we need to use that STAR format. Because, and before we go into the example, and again, this is where, if we go back to what we spoke about earlier, we spoke about people jumping in and giving a response to the question. And often people would jump straight into that STAR example. What we want you to do is to give us an overview first, because everybody's worked in a team, whether we've worked in a professional team, whether we've been involved in a sporting team, whether we've whether that team is in a job in a restaurant or whether it's in a job in a university, they're all teams scenarios. And so you've got to essentially give that overview and say, well, I've worked in a number of teams throughout my professional life. I've worked in this team, that team, another team. But the specific example that answers this question is when I was doing this particular role and something happened, and then you tell that story. So the art of storytelling is something that is much more is a much better way to be able to answer a question as opposed to just giving an idea of what you might do or what you would do. Okay. So again, so behavioural, as we said, very similar to situational. So very much the way we just discussed it. The other one that you'll often get into the academic space is the multi-barrel question. Now, a multi-barrel question basically is where they ask you 2 or 3 questions at the one time. And so what's important here is that when they ask you the question, if you're not clear on what the question is, ask them to repeat it. But make sure that you don't just stick to answering a part of it and you miss something else. Because again, this comes back to the whole idea of communication skills. And so if I ask you a question along the lines of describe a bad experience you had with a team situation, what went wrong? How was the situation resolved? Would you do anything differently? If you only answered 2 of those 3 questions, then that leaves a poor impression on the interviewer. So it's important that you address all of it. So if you're not clear on the question, then please ask them to repeat it. Okay, so we're going to have a little bit of a go at this now. We're going to look at some interview question. Oh, sorry, we're going to look at some selection criteria. And then what I'm going to give you is a few minutes to come up with some potential questions that you might be asked. Okay, so here's this is an industry position, but here's a compliance and privacy officer. So there's 5 selection criteria there. And so we'll get everybody to maybe jot down a couple of questions. I'll give you 2 minutes to do that, and then we'll have a quick discussion about what questions they might ask you. Okay, so some questions have started coming through, so I'll just start having a look at, or start talking about a couple of these. So Jackie's written, could you outline any experience you have had in the paralegal field in relation to the compliance and privacy? Okay, so where would you, where have you got that from, Jackie? So just based on the selection criteria, which criteria are you referring to? The first one, okay. So relevant degree with at least 4 years relevant regulatory compliance experience, coupled with legislative, regulatory, legal, etc., etc. Okay, great, good. All right. So Jyoti's written, how have you managed multiple projects in the past? Good. That would definitely be something that you might expect. Describe a situation where you had to use your problem-solving skills to produce a desirable outcome. Jyoti has said, tell us about your experience dealing with stakeholders, internal and external. So you can see the type of questions that start to emerge. So if I look at this essential criteria here, definitely the first one is around your technical capabilities. So they're going to ask you questions around that for sure. You can expect that. The second one is all around working within a team. And so I would say to you that the way you would prepare for that is you would say, well, I expect they might ask me a question around working independently and within a team environment. So what examples could I use in a, because it says proven capacity. So what examples could I use in an interview situation? So what you want to do is to jot down some little anecdotes that you can use when you're in that situation. The third one is saying, demonstrate the ability to work with cross-functional teams, manage multiple projects, and deliver expected outcomes. Again, demonstrated is give us an example. So you would need to use an example. Sorry, I'm just reading the question. Can you provide an example of a time you had to use your own discretion to make a decision? Yeah, great, Fallon. Thank you. So you can expect that there will be questions around how you might manage relationships. So that could potentially be around communication. Okay, so again, managing relationships is all about time management, communication skills. Again, you would want to come up with some sort of anecdotal story about when you've done that before. Now, you've all had, if you're thinking about it from the perspective of how you manage time, well, as postgraduate students, you've all had to do that. You've had to manage your time. You've had to develop, you've had to find time to prioritize your work and what have you. So that's the sort of thing that you need to be able to discuss in an interview. And then the other one is excellent problem solving skills, including the capacity for lateral thinking and conceptual and analytical skills. So there's lots of information there that will help you identify the sort of questions that you may be asked in an interview. Okay, so this is where we come to the STAR model. Is everybody familiar with the STAR model here? I know a few people have mentioned STAR. Maybe just if you can just type. So Dylan, yes. Okay, so most people are saying yes. Okay, great. All right. Well, I won't bore you with too much information here, other than to just say that if you are going to answer a question, then please do use that storytelling approach, because that really, you can go into a lot more detail. I mean, I can say to you, if I was in a situation, I would do this and I would do that. But it's so much better if you can say, when I was in that situation, this is what I did. And so that's why we want you to put yourself in that situation. We want you to outline what it was that you were doing. And then we want you to talk about the action that you took. And that's the particularly important component of this. And then we always try to end it with what the outcome of that was. But again, if you're not clear on the STAR component, then please come and see us and we can give you some information around that. But there's lots of information online about that as well. Okay, so turning our attention to stereotypes of PhDs. Now, these are some stereotypes which are in these slides, and not necessarily my opinion, but just some things that you may or may not relate to. So I'll just work through these quickly. But PhDs have only worked inside of the university and won't fit in. Is that true or false? So when you're going to an interview, you have to essentially describe all the steps that you had to take in terms to complete your PhD program with lots of detail, because you've developed skills whilst you've been studying that essentially somebody that hasn't done a PhD doesn't have. So it's important to be able to actively describe how you undertook your research, and you probably had to conduct interviews, you probably had to work with industry partners, you've consulted with people outside the university, but you need to demonstrate that you've got these skills to an employer, because often they won't understand that you've been through that process. You need to use other aspects of your life that show that you will easily adapt. So again, if you've had other work that you've participated in or other extracurricular activities, you need to show us that. So again, look at the full range of activities that you've done and think about how you can include that in your interview discussion. Another stereotype is that PhD candidates are unable to perform to a high level. So you don't do a PhD if you're not able to perform at a high level. And even a master's degree, you have to be able to perform at a high level. So highlight your track record of achievement, let people know what your grade point average is, emphasize the competition to get into a PhD program, discuss how you have had to compete against others for scholarships, if you've received scholarships or prizes or any grants that you may have had, and then talk about any conference presentations that you've done, because again, this is all high-level performance activity that you need to be able to articulate in a potential interview. Another stereotype is that if you don't go into higher education, there's something wrong with you. So some people can be suspicious because you've got a PhD, but you don't want to go into academia. So again, you need to demonstrate why you want to go in a particular career direction. So discuss how your career goals are broader than an academic career. Talk about the positives of your career direction, and essentially put a good case forward as to why you're looking to go into that particular career area. Another stereotype is that PhDs are too costly. I only need an undergraduate qualification. Look, there is sometimes you'll come up against employers who will tell you that you're overqualified. And so that's because in a lot of cases, PhDs are not understood. And some employers seem hesitant to employ what they consider someone to be overqualified. So you've got to stress the advantages that you have because you did a PhD. And essentially, I mean, I would say to you, try and apply for jobs that are at your level. Don't undersell yourself. But again, that can sometimes be challenging because sometimes the jobs that are available may not necessarily be at the level that you are probably capable of. But state that you bring not only specialised knowledge, but a range of skills and experiences in areas of research, analysis, and communication. That's just an example. And another stereotype, you'll just marking time until an academic job comes along. And this is a concern that a lot of employers will have because they think you are overqualified, you'll get bored doing what it is that you're doing with us. So from that perspective, we don't think you'll hang around. So you have to, again, explain your interest in the position and essentially show them that you do have some personal goals that are relevant to the position you're working in, and that you do have a desire to be part of that organisation. But again, this goes back to our discussion at the very beginning, which talks about, is this organisation the right place for you? It's a two-way interview, if you recall. So undertake that research into the organisation and work out how you meet and exceed what they're looking for, and then demonstrate it. Show them that you're able to, that you'll fit in and that you'll work well with them. Again, prepare a list of your strengths and think of examples that demonstrate them. This is again going back to that selection criteria. Give us examples of what you're capable of rather than just telling us what you're capable of. And then consider doing an internship or volunteer work. This can indicate your interest in the area. Now, just be careful with internships and volunteer work, because whilst we talk about internships and volunteer work, what we have to be careful of is that it's within the work, it's within the the laws of the country. So you can't go and do volunteer work for an organisation that's a for-profit organisation if it's not part of your actual course that you're studying. So just be careful with that, because some employers will take advantage of employees saying we'll give you a trial or whatever it might be, and not choose to pay you. And that's actually legal unless it's a not-for-profit or it's linked to your course. Okay, other things that people talk about is that they think that PhDs are lack real-world skills, are too theoretical. Again, just in terms of everything we've just spoken about, I think we can dismiss that pretty reasonably well. Now, in an interview, it's important that you have some questions for the interviewer as well. So we want to know, you want to have some questions at the end of the interview that demonstrate that, well, this is an opportunity for you to interview them to some extent, but also demonstrate that you have a really good understanding of the organisation. So what do you want to know? You want to know things like potential involvement in projects. What will you be doing? Will you be working on a particular project? Now, you only ask that question if they haven't already told you in the interview. What changes might be occurring in the industry, whether it's education or something else. So ideally, you can talk to some of the environmental or situational things that might be occurring, that you can essentially demonstrate your understanding of the industry. But don't try to impress with really clever questions. That's a really good way to put off an employer. One of the things that I always like to ask is questions around the culture of the organisation. So, and we're usually target at the person that's interviewing you and just saying, well, what is it that you like about working in this organisation? What's been, can you talk to me about one of the successful things that you've done? Something along those lines. And of course, you'll also want to know, when will you hear back from them? All right, who gets nervous in an interview? Anybody? So a few people saying yes. Look, as I said before, it's important that interviews are all about practice. Accept that it's natural to be nervous. So it's probably better that you're going with a little bit of some nerves as opposed to none. Because if you don't have any, then sometimes you can be a little bit flat in the interview. But it's also important that you don't waste time and energy fighting or avoiding the fact that there's some nerves. So just one thing to think about is that if you've got an interview, that means they think you can do the job. Because if they didn't think you could do it, they would not be interviewing you. So recognize the fact that you can do this, that you are competent. The fact that they've given you an interview is proof to you that you're in the running for this position. Be clear about what matters to you. What are your career goals? Where do you want to go with it? And that will generally, you've worked so hard to get through your university studies, and you've worked so hard to get through a master's degree or a PhD, and you've got there, so you're capable. So it's important that you recall those past successes and think about the achievements that you've already, the things that you've already achieved, so that should give you some confidence. But of course, that's not always going to be not the only thing that's going to be coming along. So what you do have to think about is, well, okay, let's get rid of any negative thoughts, but we also maybe want to think about some breathing exercises before an interview. So we take a deep breath, we hold it for a few seconds, we just calm ourselves. That's important that you do that sort of thing. Focus on your strengths in relation to your discipline or your practice. But the best thing you can do is participate in some mock interviews, because practice does help. And so I'm inviting you along to participate in some mock interviews with us here at the Career Service. It's a bit silly if you don't take advantage of that, because there's no additional cost to you other than your time. And so we would definitely be able to work through and talk through some of the answers that you're providing. And our role here is not to tear you apart, but it's to build you up. So please take advantage of that. The other thing to think about is that you want to fake it until you make it. And what that basically means is going with a confident positive approach, and just work your way through it. Be confident as you can be. And if you need to learn on the job, well, I'm telling you that wherever you go to work, there's always you're always going to have to learn something. So you're always going to learn on the job. So none of us know everything. So where to now? Talk with contacts people if you're looking in the higher education sector or in industry, and see if there's any potential contacts in your own personal network, and then you can essentially start applying for those jobs. People are just curious, how many people here are completing their studies in the not too distant future and are looking for work either in academia or in industry? How many people here? Anybody maybe looking for part-time work? Okay, so Jody finishes this year. And so what are you proposing to do after you complete your studies? Are you hoping to move into academia, or are you hoping to work in industry? Where do you hope to go with it?
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, I'm finishing my Juris Doctor degree, so I'm looking for grad roles, or I'm looking to work as a junior solicitor in law firms. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so have you started applying for those positions?
I have applied to a few roles, and I'm still applying. They're still opening. Some of the institutions
Yeah.
are still. Yeah. So I'm also doing like internship, as you mentioned earlier in this talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, and the reason I ask, are you applying now, is because a lot of the graduate roles that do come up, they're actually accepting applications now. A lot of them have already
Yeah.
closed.
Yeah.
Because we're now in May.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, so it's important that people are looking at those sorts of things. Okay, well look, where to now? Come and talk with Careers. If you're coming in just to get your resume checked, you don't need an appointment. You can just turn up. But if you're looking for if you want a mock interview, then they take a little bit longer. So we would get you to make an appointment. So yeah, please do take advantage of that. Okay, does anybody have any? Look, just before I ask about any questions, if you do want to practice on your own, we do have this tool called Interview Stream. And so with Interview Stream, you can go in and you can essentially get some questions and ask yourself those questions, and you can record yourself, and then you can go back and have a look. Now, as we spoke about earlier, you don't want to be overly critical of how you're approaching it, but what's important is that you're getting the structure of your answers right, so that we're giving those overviews, we're giving good examples in our responses. But look, I'm going to leave you with this thought: interviews, and it's not a PhD. It's a football game. It's practice. And so prior to a football game, you attend training 2-3 nights a week. It's repetition, repetition, repetition. Then you go out and play your game. This is exactly the same scenario. You get into a situation where you practice the questions, you keep practicing, whoever will listen, get them to listen to you, and then be ready for when you actually walk into an interview. Does anybody have any questions on any of that?
So I think you said these will be available online like next week, or?
Yeah, so Hugh will probably be able to answer that question better than me, but he will make the video and the slides available for you. So I think the video will be available on that YouTube site that he mentioned, and the slides I assume he'll make available as well.
Yes, the slides themselves I can email out to everyone who's registered for this session.
Perfect.
That much is simple. Yeah, the recording itself, as I said, will be available through the YouTube channel. I can link that one more time if you'd like.
Yeah, I got that. Yeah, so just probably, but it'll probably be like next week sometime, or?
Yes, I'd say it'd be early next week.
Yeah, no worries.
All right, perfect. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for being a part of our session this afternoon. If you do have any other questions, of course, you can come and see us. We're here at Callaghan. We're in level 3 of the Shortland building, directly above Subway. If you're in that new space, we do have people who are in that new space as well, but you'll have to go to the Student Central desk on the ground floor. If you're coming to us from Ourimbah in Sydney, then you can request an appointment with our people there as well. But thank you very much, and yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the next event, which I'm sure Hugh will keep you informed of.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
Thanks, Hugh.